Political Editor Andrew Clennell. Andrew, pressure on households and businesses equals pressure on the government as well, with Australians already in a world of pain at the petrol bowser. This is going to be another blow with mortgages on the way up too.
Yeah, well, it just wipes out every gain that was made, including on the way to the election for the government. All that kind of relief and hope that came from those rate cuts last year has dissipated. But I find it fascinating what Ross pointed out there. 5-4 decision. 5-4 decision. How can you make a 5-4 decision when inflation is around 4%? The Treasurer has said on Sunday it's going to high fours. The private sector says it's going to 5. Is it because you're worried for those members of the board who did it that we're recession bound with the war on and inflation and petrol, and that if you hike now, you know, you're looking through the rearview mirror, perhaps is the thought there, and you could endanger the economy even more. That's what you've got to think was the decision of those 4 who dissented. So I don't think the big story today, Ash, is this hike, because we're getting the Reserve Bank setting market expectations. So we're getting these hints in the weeks leading up about what's about to occur. And Andrew Houser, the Deputy Governor, made those comments which suggested it was about to occur. That set that off. So we knew it was a rate hike, you know. It's like the sky's blue today. But what is intriguing to me is this, how close this vote is, and a real divide in that RBA board about the best way forward with this fragile economy. Now, the government, but not only the government, the Australian public has to hope that this war ends soon. And the government, in my view, has to think about cutting petrol excise, because petrol influences so many price points. And if we continue to get this oil shock, well, then the entire economy could be coming crashing down. And even with low unemployment, we could be looking at the R word, Ash.
Ross, I'd like your take on that, throwing around the R word, recession. We heard there from Andrew about this being a fragile economy. How delicate is the Australian economy at this point in relation to those shocks we're seeing from overseas?
Well, it is true, but then the Reserve Bank really looks at both employment and then also looks at inflation as its foremost target. Now, inflation is too high at the moment, so it's got to respond to that inflation. But to Andrew's point, the real issue is if you get rising interest rates and you've got rising fuel prices, adding to pressure for business in particular, but then to households, if the Australian economy slows up markedly, that could lead to prices falling rapidly, which would be the recession, and also unemployment rising rapidly. So to Andrew's point, you would hope that there would be a rapid end to the war in the Middle East, because you do need those supplies of fuel, and Australia quite clearly has got shortages of fuel, leading to these very high prices. Now, at this point, the Reserve Bank can only respond by raising interest rates, but there is a point at which it can raise too much, literally one last straw in the camel's back, and that could be the ultimate undoing of it. It would then have to wind back these interest rate rises that it's now delivering. And so, you know, in many ways, often central banks do look through these sort of short-term factors, but the reality is it can't look through those things right now because it knows that there is already inflation that's sticking out our economy, and this again puts pressure on the government and on its budget when it delivers it in May.
Andrew, we're waiting to hear from the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, also the Shadow, Tim Wilson. What sort of tone are you expecting them to take when they do jump up in front of the microphones?
Oh, well, Jim Chalmers will be it's all the fault of the war, and Tim Wilson will be it's all the fault of the government. I mean, if you want to really put it in a nutshell, that's what you're about to hear. But I'm not sure either of these gentlemen are particularly winning this afternoon. I think the winner's One Nation. And One Nation, we've seen their vote go up because they're portraying themselves as outside this system. You know, that's a success that they're kind of having at the moment, whether it's about immigration or whether it's about, you know, cost of living. That's where they're positioning themselves. We'll do it differently. You know, they're going to come under more scrutiny, and they might have some problems then when people look at their actual policies. But at the moment, they're in the sweet spot of saying everything's turned to manure. You should look at us. whereas the Liberals and Labor are seen as part of the system which generates this sort of pain for consumers, rightly or wrongly. And I'd suggest wrongly, because they've got to make, decisions of government to keep the economy afloat. I mean, you can argue with the various aspects of that. You could argue that the government hasn't done enough for the private sector, for example, but people are seeing out there or believing that there's not enough of a difference between the sort of economic conformity that both major parties have as part of their platforms, and that's why they're fleeing to One Nation at the moment.